TellyCast, the TV industry news review.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby, and welcome to this week's TellyCast. On this week's show, my guests are President of Access Entertainment, Danny Cohen, and Val Cazalet, partner of Moore Kingston Smith. And winter is coming as K7 Media's Gertz leases looks at what the coming months might have in store for broadcasters and streamers. It's all coming up on this week's TellyCast. This week's show is sponsored by Moore Kingston Smith, the specialist advisors and accountants for TV, film and radio companies. Their dedicated office of over 100 media specialists is based in the heart of Medialand in the West End of London. They understand the TV industry and what keeps TV bosses awake at night. The Moore Kingston Smith team works closely with many trade bodies such as APA, WFTV, Animated Women and British Arrows. They've delivered many high-profile industry projects, including advice regarding the qualification of British films and preparation of applications to the DCMS, liaising with national authorities and monitoring projects and applications to the Foreign Entertainers Unit, as well as the certification of production costs for film, television, animation and video games productions. As one of the UK's top 20 accounting and advisory firms, Moore Kingston Smith provides a complete service offering to the TV industry, including corporate finance, tax structuring, employment service, and efficient personal tax planning. They're also a member firm of Moore Global Network Limited, meaning they're well placed to support you and your business with any international requirements you may have. To find out more, just search Moore Kingston Smith. So on this week's show, I'm delighted to welcome Danny Cohen and Val Cazalet. Danny is president of Access Entertainment, a division of Access Industries focused on investments across TV, film, theatre and digital content. Prior to joining Access, Danny was director of BBC Television, where he led the BBC TV's networks and BBC Productions. His role encompassed the greenlighting and production of all of the BBC's drama, comedy, entertainment and unscripted programmes. Danny also oversaw the BBC's film label, BBC Films, and provided editorial leadership for the BBC's digital platform, the iPlayer. He was also a member of the board of the BBC. Previously, Danny was controller of the BBC's main network, BBC One, controller of BBC Three, head of E4 and head of documentaries for Channel 4. And Val is partner of one of the UK's leading accountancy and advisory firms, Moore Kingston Smith. With 30 years' experience of working with individuals and companies in many areas of the creative sector and with a particular interest in film and television, Val works with a range of creative businesses, including AIM-listed companies, SMEs, groups of companies, and individuals. She offers advice that's tailored to each client's specific need, and her media experience includes clients in brand design, advertising, events management, production and special effects, internet and technology, PR, radio, as well as film and TV. She's a board member and treasurer of both Women in Film and TV and Animated Women. So welcome to the show, Val and Danny.
Lovely to be on the show, Justin. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. Great to have you both on the show. Danny, coming to you first. Many of our listeners know you from your time at the BBC, both as controller of BBC Three and BBC One, and latterly, of course, director of television at the BBC, where you led the corporation's TV networks and BBC Productions, Europe's largest TV production group. Now you're president of Access Entertainment. Can you tell us a little bit about your new business, or your current business, should I say, and your investments?
Yes, of course. So at Access, I invest in feature films, television, live theatre and digital content. So it's a content-focused business, but across 4 different content sectors. We also have a physical footprint. We own the West End Theatre, the Theatre Royal Haymarket. So we've started buying theatres as well as investing in musicals and plays.
Presumably, you've obviously got a very wide spread of media investments. the last few months has seen those affected in a variety of ways, of course.
Yeah, it's been interesting having that span to see how different sectors of the business have been affected, and of course in different ways. Digital is obviously surging, and our investments in YouTube, actually in particular YouTube related content, have been doing incredibly well during this period. Obviously television production has had to halt for a while and is getting going again. Feature films, we were going to make probably 3 this summer, but they've all been delayed till next year. And our theatre, the Haymarket, has been closed since March. So that's problematic, obviously, because you're just waiting for that to open and there's no real clarity about when that might be. So it feels like everything is going to get going again relatively soon in film and theatre. Indeed, some of it has, of course, started again. But the one that's really static at the moment because of the pandemic is theatre and investments in theatrical productions.
Yeah, of course. And we'll come back to TV investments in a little while. But first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about public service broadcasting and the BBC, which was highly praised early on in the pandemic for a number of different initiatives it rolled out, particularly in education, as many of us were forced to attempt homeschooling. And this was followed a period of speculation about the corporation's future under the then new Tory government. What do you think a public service broadcaster's role in a pandemic should be?
Well, the primary one is to speak the truth and to speak truth to power where it's needed and to present factual information as clearly and effectively as possible. So I think in a pandemic, the news and current affairs of the BBC is front and centre of what it needs to do, as often it is. And in an age where there's fake news, as it's become called, and lots of misleading information online and on social media, having a news source that people feel they can absolutely rely on to speak the truth and to present things fairly is really, really critical. So I think that's the first thing. But of course, the BBC's always been there to do more than one thing, and it's been there to educate and entertain as well as inform. And I think entertaining people during this period is pretty important, that people's physical health is at risk, but also I think their mental health and their happiness during all of this. And so I think the BBC's role in making people happy, making them laugh, giving them stuff to do is actually very important too.
And obviously that has been problematic in its own right in terms of creating this content. Looking now towards Christmas, we're not that too far away, or 8 or 9 weeks away. Considering all those production upheavals that we've seen this year, I'm fascinated to hear your thoughts on how the BBC should approach scheduling this Christmas. I mean, what can they put on screens to deliver what you just said? It's about entertaining, put a smile back on people's faces. That must be quite a scheduling challenge.
Christmas is very important on the BBC because it's a time the nation really comes together and they really appreciate what the BBC can offer. I suspect, I'm not talking to people in direct detail about it, but they'll have to take an overview of how much content they believe they're going to have available over the next 6 to 9 months. And because they're already starting to spread, I think quite effectively, the content they have across larger swathes of the schedule. So that I'm sure want to make Christmas as special as possible, and New Year, because New Year's Day is also a very big year for the BBC in terms of viewing. They'll want to make it as special as possible, but I'm sure they'll also have an eye to making sure that they're not using up so much content that the first quarter of 2021 feels quite bare. I think in particular it will be about BBC One because it's about BBC One more than anything at Christmas on the BBC. So there'll perhaps be even more focus on what BBC One can deliver for families and for people in general than ever before, as they look to make sure there's enough there for people to enjoy. I can't tell exactly how much they'll have, but they'll have an eye on making it special, but also making sure quarter one of 2021 is rich and satisfying enough for viewers.
Would your guess be that they have enough content both in the can, if you like, but also they're able to produce between now and then to create a schedule that's on a par with what we've seen before?
I don't know for sure, but I think they'll do their very best. And I think they'll perhaps, concentrate content from some of the other channels onto one where they need to. They'll also use feature films, family feature films have always been an important thing on the BBC at Christmas, and I think play a really nice family role. So maybe you'll see one or two more of those from their library than normal. But I think they'll do their best to make sure BBC One in particular is as special as possible. And I think they'll probably get there, because sometimes, the shows at Christmas are one-off specials of certain comedies and so on. And so hopefully with production now beginning again, they'll be able to squeeze in enough production to get stuff ready for that Christmas week in particular and New Year.
As your business is focused around strategic investments, the current content industry headwinds will presumably throw up some interesting opportunities that you may not have considered before, or that we're going to see lots of different companies affected in different ways in different sectors. Are you looking to invest any more in TV production businesses, for example?
Yeah, I certainly think that out of the disruption will come opportunities for people, hopefully good opportunities to grow creative content even further. I think the other thing to say about that is that there was two disruptions going on at once, as it were. There was the disruption that's been taking place anyway because of digital adoption and streaming, and now that's been accelerated by the pandemic. So you've got two things going on at once that affect all content industries, I suppose. So I think they'll come together and there will be some opportunities. It's quite hard to know yet exactly where those might be and where will be best placed to do so. We'll continue to look at content businesses, of course, and both here and in particularly on the West Coast as well. So I can imagine us doing that again, but we're not in dialogue with anyone at the moment to make a new investment like that.
And in terms of the TV sector, what are your investments right now?
We have a range of different investments. We have a stake in Bad Wolf, Jane Tranter, Julie Gardner's production company. We have stakes on the West Coast in Spanish language production businesses. We do investment deals in feature film content. We have quite a range. We also, because my company also has an 80% stake in Warner Music, we do quite a lot with Warner Music in that area. So there's a fair amount spread out around the world. We own a broadcaster in Israel. We're the majority owner of Reshet, one of the two commercial broadcasters in Israel. So without making a sort of list, it will give you a sense that it ranges across English language, Spanish language, broadcast platforms. My company also owns a majority in DAZN, which is a sports streaming service that has been growing pretty well in Japan, Germany, and some other countries.
No, I wasn't aware of that. That's interesting. Obviously, a very diversified portfolio you have. How about distribution businesses?
It's never been something we particularly focused on to build the infrastructure of. As I say, within the group, DAZN's not a direct investment I made. It was made many, many years ago by Access. And we also own a majority in a music streaming business, Deezer, which is pretty popular in Europe and the Middle East. So we have some distribution businesses. They're obviously very cash acquisitive. You have to put a lot of money to build them up. So we're not planning to distribute in TV and film at the moment. We really like working with partners, and in our feature film slate, we'll always either co-finance or co-produce sometimes with a partner, and often that co-finance partner will be a distributor. We like having partners, and we feel we learn a lot from having partners, and we gain from it rather than wanting to totally control things ourselves.
I'm coming back to channels for a second. I mean, particularly when we're looking at the UK, and the linear channels and public service broadcasters seem to be in the news pretty much constantly for a variety of reasons. Before the BBC, you were head of documentaries at Channel 4 and you ran E4. What are your thoughts on reports of Channel 4 possibly being privatised following a review of public service broadcasting?
I was disappointed to hear that that's come round the merry-go-round again. The very first thing I ever worked on production was promotional video, a 30-minute promotional video that Channel 4 had commissioned a production company that I was working for called TVF to produce as kind of argument against privatisation. That was in 1996, and I was a sort of junior researcher on it. And it's one of those things that just, 25 years later, it's still coming round. And I suppose the question you have to ask yourself is, why hasn't it been needed in the last 24 years? And the reason is that the creativity and dynamism and ingenuity of the people who run Channel 4 and commission its programs and produce the programs have always found a way to keep the channel buoyant, commercially viable, and highly creative. And I think that will hopefully continue to be the case, and that they'll be able to fight off another round of publicity and press and government pressure, if it indeed comes to that, around privatisation. It's such a waste of energy for the people at Channel 4 to spend all of that time thinking about that and having to defend itself and all of that, when actually it should focus on making great programs and ensuring it's commercially viable. So I'm hoping it won't become another thread, because it's a cyclical thread of Channel 4's existence and its public affairs, and it's just not necessary, and it's not the right thing for Channel 4 and its audiences or the British public.
Okay, but I suppose now more than ever, as we're seeing all of this disruption, and the government is looking at media in a different way, you feel, to how they have over the last sort of 25 years. And obviously Channel 4 has also had challenges being a business that purely relies on advertising income. That has obviously dried up over the year. Obviously it's coming back now, and it's great to see that. But presumably now, we might see things coming to a head as we go through the next 6 months or so.
Well, I hope that's not the case. And my sense is that Channel 4's income has bounced back post the lockdown period pretty well, and it's doing okay. They've got a digital plan which they need to execute, and obviously the world is moving more and more to streaming content than linear channels, but they seem to have a clear plan on that. And so I hope it won't come to that, and I hope it will continue to make great programs that mean it never has to worry about that. The fundamental of Channel 4 has always been the quality and the creativity of the programs it produces and the producers who make them. And I feel confident if it continues to do that, which it will, given the strength of the UK production community, it can survive, it can commercially thrive, and it doesn't need to become part of a large commercial group which will dilute its mission and its quality.
Back to the BBC for a second. Now, George Osborne is the latest name to be linked with a job of BBC chairman, according to reports just last week. And other names in the frame include David Dimbleby, Trevor Phillips, and former Culture Secretary Lady Morgan. Who would be your tip for the role, and what qualities does the successful candidate need to succeed in that role?
I think you've got to have a thick skin, because you're likely to get brickbats from many directions a lot of the time. I think you've got to have a really clear vision of the future in terms of digital adoption and the shift to streaming. I think you've got to be a really good people person, because you've got to, take people with you and inspire you. In terms of who that person might be, I must admit, I'm afraid I don't really have a tip as a person. It'd be nice to have some diversity right at the top of the organization. So, if there's someone that can bring that, that would be terrific. So maybe there's a candidate out there that would fit that brief. And also, I think the final thing I'd say is you have to be someone who's willing to stand up to government, because governments, perhaps of all shades, will always put pressure on the BBC, whether that's because of an editorial choice the government doesn't like, or in terms of its next funding settlement. So you've got to not only be able to have a thick skin when it comes to the media, but I think you've also really got to be willing to stand up to government and be a very sharp negotiator, because given where we are with the pandemic and the impact that's going to have on public finances and the impact it's going to have on people's personal finances, it wouldn't surprise me if there was more pressure on the BBC and the license fee around the time of the next settlement.
Talking about digital and streaming, and you mentioned in terms of your investments into YouTube creators and digital businesses, obviously things are moving very much more towards that digital as being the new normal, if you like, in terms of our industry. What would be your predictions for TV over the next few months? Obviously, we're going into what some people predict is going to be quite a tough winter for businesses right across the UK, let alone TV businesses. But what would be your predictions for the industry? What change are we going to see?
I think the thing that I feel is that there's going to be a really, really extraordinary and pretty wonderful surge of creativity in the next 12 to 24 months when we get the worst of this pandemic behind us, because a lot of amazing people and creative people have not been in production, and they've spent time developing new work, developing new ideas, writing new scripts. And, this is true of theatre and film as well as television. And it's all bursting to find audiences and go into production. I think when the worst of this is out of the way, and hopefully that will be the case by the spring, I think it's actually going to be a very, very exciting time for the creative industries. And we're talking about television in particular here, because there's this huge seam of creativity that's been building up. that people have been sitting at home preparing. And that's going to be unleashed in a way which I think is going to be pretty wonderful once we get to the other side of this.
Let's keep our fingers crossed for that. I mean, it's been an extraordinary time of, months not being able to produce. And as we talked about earlier on, channels having, severe impact on their incomes. Let's just hope that it's a little bit like the champagne bottle being shaken up over these months, and next year's the time when the cork's going to come off.
That's right. And I think as well as that surge of creative ingenuity and skill and production, I think also it may be an interesting time in terms of work with a really interesting small p political voice, because this has been such a dramatic and disruptive moment in our lives, in society, in culture. And that often leads writers to say very interesting things about the world and to interpret the world in new ways and to challenge traditional ways of thinking and the way people tend to perceive the world. So I'm hopeful not only that there'll be this terrific surge of creativity unleashed when all of this development can be commissioned and reach production, but also new, existing and fresh voices will also say some different things about the world, because certainly this period has made us all stop and think about life and about society.
That's certainly something to look forward to. Val, coming to you, welcome to the show. We've spoken to many business leaders in TV during the pandemic, producers, broadcasters, streamers, distributors. And when I've asked them how business has been going over the past 6 months, we've had, as you might imagine, a variety of responses, perhaps some more realistic than others. But this is the first time we've had a partner at a leading industry accountancy business on the show. So you're ideally placed to tell us, how has the pandemic been affecting the TV business?
We act for clients across, many of the sectors of TV and film. So production companies, post-production companies, distribution, freelancers, and then even within those subsectors, the clients have been affected in different ways. So, for example, documentary producers, some of those have been pretty much able to carry on filming throughout, taking all the necessary measures, depending on what kind of documentaries they make. Some with quite creative measures on how to do it, but have started up filming again. Drama was stopped again pretty much back in March, but again we're starting to see slowly productions coming back. Some clients are starting shooting because they've got funding that will run out, so productions have started up. I was quite interested in the news at the weekend, just seeing that Batman's started up as well as in Chicago, but in Liverpool, in tier 3. And I was thinking, well, that's got to be a good sign, if a production like that can carry on in, the highest town, with tier 3. There's also production companies looking after live events, and again, that was, pretty much came to a halt in March. Lots of those, things like awards ceremonies were all just stopped. That's been good to see that some of those, have been able to go through in lockdown and, nice ceremonies have happened. Rather than events being cancelled, it's that they've now just been delayed through to the next year.
You mentioned post-production. How's post-production been affected?
Post, I suppose it didn't hit quite so quickly because, again, the nature of their work, they were able to carry on finishing off films that were in production. Some of them were able to, get staff working from home. They will see more of a hit coming up in the next few months where some of the production work has dried up. Going on then, say to distribution, some of those clients, have got much increased demand. Some of the shows, that they hadn't previously been able to sell, people have taken those up now.
All these streaming platforms and networks, they're looking for fresh content. And as you say, they'll probably be in a position to take on shows that they might not have taken in usual circumstances.
We act for, a lot of advertising companies as well. Again, they stopped back in March, but they came back a bit quicker. I wouldn't say things are back to normal with those, but, they're probably up to about, if we had to estimate, maybe about 70% of what they would normally do. I suppose the other area where with freelancers, they're the people who've probably been most badly affected, with the notable exception of people working in animation or VFX, who've been able to do that from home. Some of those have been severely affected, unless they've been able to take advantage of the self-employed scheme. Lots of those people have personal service companies and haven't been able to get any government assistance at all.
That's been very well documented, and certainly in the UK industry, there's been a number of different support schemes that I've seen in place for them. Winter is coming, Val, and many of us expect it to be challenging on many fronts. What do businesses need to do to prepare for the next 6 months?
Well, I think the main thing that we would suggest is for them to have a business plan. And by that, I mean an integrated cash flow, profit and loss forecast and balance sheet. It's essential for them to be able to manage cash flow, but they also need to be able to manage their profitability as well. So if they're looking at that and they can see that they're profitable, but there's gaps in that financing, they need to be able to quantify those gaps and how long that liquidity problem is going to be there. It may be they can go to their investors and get more money if they've got those gaps. I think the other thing to note is that some of that government support is still there. CBILS loans are still available until the 30th of November. So if people haven't done that, they can go and see if they need to make any applications for funding. And I think it's important to look at all the different scenarios, because the worst thing would be to go and get a loan and it's not enough. You need to look at it and think, well, what happens if my production gets shut down? What happens if some of my staff get ill?
So it's about being realistic, isn't
Yes.
it, Val? It's about planning for the worst case scenario. We've seen lots of different rules being brought in across different parts of the UK and obviously across Europe and beyond. There are different lockdown and restrictions happening. So it's about being realistic and perhaps plan for the worst case scenario.
Absolutely. It is a time, that people need to also start thinking about their staffing levels and matching their capacity against income they've got in the pipeline. The furlough scheme will be coming to an end at the end of October. The job support scheme that is coming in place is far less generous. And I think people need to have a look and match that capacity. Now is the time to be looking and saying, do I need to make any of the excess staff that I've got redundant? But I think it is very important to note that redundancy is an expensive thing to do. If you've got projects going into the pipeline that you think you'll be filming in January, February, you don't want to be making people redundant now, because the costs of that redundancy, you won't feel the benefit until later next year. So it may be that you want to ride it out and you want to take advantage of the job support scheme for that limited time.
Obviously, it has to be a business decision when things, when we get down to it. But obviously, it's very, very difficult making people redundant. But you have to look at this as a purely business decision. What are the other options available to people rather than pure redundancy? Are there different ways that producers, for example, can look at ways to maintain relationships with staff without actually cutting them out of the business completely?
Yeah, I mean, if people are engaged with their staff and they're open and honest with them, we found there's a real acceptance, of people understanding the situation and taking pay cuts. We've seen that happen across the board with lots of companies. Another option on that is one of the, I suppose, plus sides is that, most businesses, the valuations of them are lower at the moment. So for some staff, it's not for everybody, but, for those, staff that you want to incentivize, that you can see coming up through a business, giving them share options or shares is often what people want to do. And if the valuations of businesses are lower at the moment because profitability is down, it can be a good time to give them those, shares or share options now.
Now, Val, you've also got clients in other sectors. Are there any trends you're seeing that might point to changes we might see coming through the TV industry, like mergers and acquisitions, for example?
Back in March, I think activity literally just stopped. I think at the moment there are companies who would like to buy. They're looking for a good investment. They're looking for companies where they may be able to get, buy companies on a reduced valuation. Those people are out there. What there is, I think, is a lack of people wanting to sell at this moment. And I think that's probably because the government furlough scheme has been quite good, that people have been able to keep their staff on. Over the next few months, through winter, beginning of next year, that maybe people will look to see if they want to sell and be acquired by another company. And those acquirers might be private equity firms or, other businesses where, they went into the pandemic with a strong cash flow, strong balance sheet, and it's still, they've still got the resources there to take on companies.
And now it's time for Story of the Week, where my guests get to highlight the key news stories that's caught their eye in the trade press this week. Danny, what's your story of the week?
Well, it's been interesting to see this news about a restructure at ITV. So that's the one I would pick for this week.
Big story when it comes to not only the domestic UK TV landscape, but internationally as well. And this is the news that the company is restructuring to establish a media and entertainment division that will house a dedicated on-demand business unit alongside its traditional broadcast counterpart. And, this is obviously the focus much more of the business towards streaming and, this digitization of a traditionally linear broadcaster. We've talked about the move to digital, Danny. I mean, was this inevitable, do you think?
Well, I think all major content and distribution businesses must be looking at this and are doing it in different, but perhaps ways that echo each other. We've actually just seen in the US in the last 4 weeks, NBC Universal, the Comcast business has restructured, Disney has restructured, Warner Brothers has restructured, and all of those restructures in varying ways put a greater emphasis on digital content and streaming. And all of them in different ways make it clear that streaming is a real emphasis of the business, but also that decisions on where content will go will be made differently. So companies that have both linear channels and streaming platforms will begin to make decisions differently depending on what their options are. If you're Disney, you've obviously got Disney Plus, and there's also Hulu there, and so on. So I think you're seeing there with ITV part of a wider pattern, with the emphasis moving not just in terms of where audiences are going, but the structures of some pretty big organizations beginning to shift over at the same time to be run like that. And actually, in some cases, with people at the top of those organizations, like Jason Kilar at Warner Brothers and that business, the AT&T business, who come from a streaming background. His background was obviously running Hulu. So it's really interesting to see. And it will be very interesting to see now how they distribute their content, where they choose to prioritize content, both for television, but actually, for movies as well. We've seen over the last few months, a number of movies due to the pandemic go straight to streaming platforms.
Yeah.
It may be in the future that we'll see more of that, maybe with shorter cinema windows, and then the movies moving to streaming platforms earlier, or even a continuation of this pattern where you get a premium VOD window where families can watch new movies at home for £30, $40 instead of watching it in the cinema. So I think this disruption is only really beginning. The organizations like ITV and like Warner Brothers and Disney and AT&T, obviously Warner Brothers and AT&T, the same thing, are all thinking, how do we get ourselves structurally organized to be there and think about our content, its distribution in the right way, given the audience patterns of behavior?
And how do you think this is going to affect commissioning and the content that's being commissioned? What do you think the impact will be on producers, for example?
Well, it's a good question. I think it's still pretty much an open question. It seems to me there'll still be some really clear commissioning for specific platforms, whether that's a linear channel or elsewhere. But there also may begin to be instances where one of these companies greenlights something, doesn't decide until later in the process what's the optimum place for that content to be initially distributed. Will it be first online, or will it be on a linear channel, or will it be a kind of mixture of the two? I think we'll see a mixture of very specific targeted content commissioning for specific platforms, but also some degree of these major companies holding back a decision on where content will be placed until later on in the process.
And presumably the traditional an hour TV show block that we're all used to, particularly when it comes to commercial TV and linear commercial TV channels, that's potentially up for change as well. If you want to make a show that's an hour and 15 minutes long, then you can do, and maybe another one for 43 minutes long. I mean, presumably that model is also subject to change now.
Yeah, it's going to be a mixed ecology, isn't it? And I think that's been the case for some time, that you've got content that's going straight onto streaming platforms or VOD services that's different lengths, and producers can make different episodes of the same series at different lengths. And there'll still be a need for linear channels for content that fits a very specific block of time to fit a linear schedule. So I think we're going to see a mixture of both. That enhances creativity. One of my favorite drama series over the last couple of years has been End of the Fucking World, which started on Channel 4 and has been on Netflix. And they're about 20 minutes, those episodes, and it is really, really fantastic, beautifully produced drama series. So I think it's going to add to creativity. It's going to give authorship more control of how they tell their stories. But at the same time, there'll still, of course, be a demand for those key linear channels for content that fits a linear schedule.
Val, tell us about your story of the week.
Well, I think for me it was the film and TV restart scheme that finally got approval on Friday. Had state aid approval, and the scheme was also extended for another couple of months to the end of February.
Right. Okay.
So I know it's been open for applications for early applications for a couple of weeks before. But, I think that was a really good news story.
Yeah, well, we had John McVeigh from PACT, who was leading one of the industry organisations involved in lobbying for that, which is the UK government's £500 million scheme for future coronavirus-related losses, including filming delays from illness across the cast and crew, etc. So that's been also extended until, you say, February next year?
Yeah, so if people start shooting before February, there was, I think, a worry before then, because the shooting was, the original draft was that shooting was to start before 31st of December. And there was, I think people were worried there was going to be this big rush to start shooting. But, the extra 2 months, I think, is a welcome.
Can you remind us what else the scheme covers off?
You have to be a UK company or resident in the UK or resident in the EEA. 50% of your budget has got to be spent in the UK. It's got to pass the cultural test. The rest of the insurance you've got to have got from another insurance company. So this is only for COVID losses. It can't be an excluded production. So, in the same way, the same things really that apply for when you're getting, film certification. So it can't be a promotional film. It can't be a training film. It can't be a news or current affairs. So long as it qualifies for all of those criteria, if you pay the fee, which is 1% of the production budget, you are entitled to a maximum of 20% of the budget caused by COVID delays. If the project was abandoned altogether, you can get up to 70% of the budget for abandonment, but that has to be agreed.
You said the cultural test. What does that mean?
Basically, qualifying as a British film or as a co-production. The normal rules that would apply for that, so in the same way, when you're able to, for getting UK tax credit.
Okay. All right. Interesting. And now it's time for my guests to nominate their hero of the week and who or what they want to tell to get in the bin. Val, who's your hero of the week?
I don't have one hero, Justin. I would like to put my heroes of the week as being all of the CEOs, and people who run all of those trade organisation and membership organisations. Saying that, I suppose it particularly came to my mind because of the film and TV restart scheme, which I know John McVeigh from PACT has been, at the forefront of lobbying for that. But all of the CEOs of the trade organisations, have done tremendous work over this period. the likes of Steve Davis from the APA, been really supporting members. Liz Tucker, who's acting CEO for Women in Film and TV, who has done a huge amount helping members and is still trying to lobby, for those freelancers. But all of the other organisations, I think, deserve recognition.
Quite right. Excellent. And Val, what's going in your bin?
In the bin, I wanted to put an article that was in The Observer on Sunday, which, to be honest, was an article that basically just sensationalised a nothing story about tax credits. It was questioning whether, the James Bond franchise, I think we'd all recognise that as being a British film, culturally British.
Doesn't get much more British than James Bond, does it?
Yes, whether that, should, because it's such a profitable franchise, should have been able to access those tax credits, when lots of people in the industry, are suffering at the moment and, freelancers are suffering. But the whole point of the tax credit scheme was to make sure, that, films such as those were filmed in the UK.
Yeah.
They bring a huge amount of investment to the UK. And if the tax credit is large, it's because there's been a lot of spend in the UK. So I know there were lots of other things in that article as well, but I just thought it could easily, lead people to wrong conclusions on it. That was all.
We'll share the link to that in the episode description. But it did seem a little bit of an unfair slant on what is obviously a very well-known franchise, one of the biggest franchises in film, created in the UK. A lot of it is filmed in the UK and produced, and post-production happens in the UK. So it seems to me that's a quite right and proper use of whatever funding resources there are out there. Danny, who's your hero of the week?
Can I mention two?
Of course. Yeah, go for it.
My first would be Bill Gates, because, I've admired him for a huge amount of time, a man who truly changed the world in the first half of his career and is now dedicated to improving and enhancing the quality of people's lives and their health in the second half by giving so much of his money away. But at this particular moment in time, I feel like he's the person I listen to most on the pandemic and the person I trust most, because he's so sharp, he's so very, very bright, and he has great insight and experience of the vaccine world, given all the work Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have done on polio and the vaccines for polio. So I think he's a hero and someone that I would trust now more than ever. And my other heroes would be related, which is the scientists working on the vaccines, because they're, in a wonderful way, in a sense, they become the rock stars of this moment. We're all waiting to see what they do. We're all waiting to see whether they can produce a vaccine which can help get our lives back to normal. So those would be my two heroes.
We've been told all the way through this, it's not going to be for a year, 2 years until the vaccine comes. But the ability to test quickly and vaccine being rolled out together doesn't now seem so far away.
I hope that's right. And there's a whole range of companies, AstraZeneca with the Oxford vaccine, Pfizer, Moderna, many more, all working on vaccines, some of which work differently from others, which is a good thing in terms of trying lots of different things. So I hope that's the case. And I hope by then people will be, taking the vaccine and as I say, life will get a bit more back to normal. It will still take time from what I read. I'm absolutely no expert on it to vaccinate enough people. So it seems to me still the quality we all need, whether it's in the television industry or more broadly, is patience and resilience through the next few months. Those are the two things we need most: patience and resilience, particularly through the winter. But I agree, it's the vaccines are the light at the end of the tunnel, and I think that makes these scientists who are clearly working incredibly hard to get these things through the testing, the safety, and the testing on efficacy. They're the heroes of the age.
Absolutely, and as you say, the rock stars of their time, and that's hopefully they're all going to be rewarded in due course for that.
Yeah.
And who or what are you telling to get in the bin, Danny?
I'm a Liverpool fan, and quite obsessively so. And it was not a good weekend for Liverpool. For those who don't follow football, we had our really, really key player injured in the game, and it wasn't properly dealt with by the referee. And then there was one of those ridiculous VAR offside decisions, which meant that Liverpool's injury time winner was cancelled out. So VAR's in the bin for me.
Right.
I've been quite open to it, and I actually, when it was first trialled during the World Cup a couple of years ago at least, I thought it worked incredibly well. And I'm still really bewildered at how badly it seems to be being implemented in England.
Yeah.
It just seems odd that they just seem so bad at it, that they make such poor decisions.
It's the talking point as much as the game itself. I mean, you can almost guarantee there's going to be some sort of controversy. I mean, do you think it's impacting on the televisual viewing experience of football?
I mean, when it's done well, I don't think it's a problem. And actually, it can add drama. I remember in that World Cup, the referees were using the screens on the side of the pitch much more regularly, and it was really effective. And it's one of the things that is a mystery to me in terms of the way that VAR is being used in the Premier League, that referees so rarely go over to the screen. Because I can't believe, for example, with that tackle on Virgil van Dijk, which has left him with such a serious injury, that if the referee had gone over to the screen, there would have been a different outcome. I just don't understand that. So I think it's maybe it's not VAR, but it's the implementation of VAR in the Premier League that's the real villain here, because it just does not seem to be being implemented in a really effective and competent way.
Well, Val and Danny, thank you so much for coming on this week's show. I've really enjoyed having you on and hearing about all the different investments and changes that are going on from a financial perspective in the industry. So thanks again for coming on, and see you in person very soon.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
And now it's time to head over to the cold plains of Riga to catch up with Gertz. Gertz, how are you doing?
Hi, Justin. You have those stereotypes. It's not that bad.
Really? I have this vision of the Russian steppes or some sort of...
It's not in Siberia. It's by the Baltic Sea.
Yes. No, I know. My geography is terrible, obviously. But we're talking about winter is coming, aren't we?
We are, yeah. And it is coming, probably, yeah. But I think you have noticed that I am always trying to look at opportunities first, right?
Always look on the bright side of life.
Yeah. So, the good news is I think that particularly with all the pandemic's limiting measures in place again, people will be hungry to watch telly and to watch online. I think we can expect high numbers there in the same way as we have seen last spring during the first wave. It does open up opportunities, like I said, for broadcasters and for platforms, as long as they can still find enough new shows in their pipeline or possess a strong, big volume library. So this is where the strength of bigger players currently lie. Those broadcasters which are running an extensive international production business network with some effort could probably be more creative, at least to some extent, in finding ways to keep the productions moving, depending on the epidemiological situation in their different territories. Now, it's also the time for those studio streamers to shine, which believed in pulling back their IP from the third-party platforms. Co-productions with third parties is obviously one of the areas hit the hardest, and according to various analysts, can take up to 5 years to fully recover to pre-COVID levels. But I think there is a chance for innovative forms of co-productions, whether it's in neighboring country bubbles or common language bubbles, and could apply to various stages of productions. Yes, we are going to see less variety of on-location shoots and less extras involved, but at least to some extent it will boost other areas of production, like evolving usage of CGIs, for instance. And because different parties are still going to look for ways to accumulate co-financing and sharing the risks, I think we are just going to see new models of co-productions. Possibly we are going to see development models changing as well as the existing model used, particularly by many traditional broadcasters, which love to get heavily involved in development, can turn out to be just too resource consuming compared to the somewhat lighter approach by many streamers. So I think on the business side, this winter will continue to be a big testing ground, learning how we are all going to work for the years to come.
Now, different analysts have been pointing out that the viewing peak that we experienced in the spring might now be over.
The total viewing has been flattening out recently, true, but it needs to be considered that during the summer lockdown, measures were eased and people were able to increasingly turn to other activities. I think the current signs suggest the viewing habits of the past spring may return this winter again. Family or household viewing trend will continue. Most likely, it will even experience a further growth. I believe there is a good reason why Netflix had been quite vocal recently about looking into family entertainment as well. But we also have to consider that nothing is standing still. Things are constantly changing, evolving. And in the same way as we know more about the virus now than we did 6 months ago, I think we can expect viewers to become more picky, more demanding, and also more tech savvy, if you wish, to find exactly what they want and where and when they want. Therefore, it will become more difficult for channels and platforms to retain their loyal audiences without enough new shows or some kind of other innovative tricks how they could maybe compensate any lack of fresh offering. One example, last week there were some data posted from research pointing out that even something like voice control devices may affect content consumption, claiming that those using such devices are on average happier with their experience, as it considerably improves their path to a suitable choice, while the other states want browsing through thousands of hours of options before finally admitting there was nothing to watch.
Yes. I have that all the time. I have to say, with my family, obviously we've got all the terrestrial channels, Netflix, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, Sky, almost everything when it comes to subs. And we sit down and try and watch a movie together, a family movie, and we never agree.
I know. Well, obviously, in most cases, such statement is an exaggeration, but it's human to find a scapegoat to make feel better themselves, right? But I'm also a bit skeptical about such research, though, if I'm honest, because as everything else, this should be analyzed in context. And my inner voice control says that curious, active, and more entrepreneurial people are usually more positive and thus may just provide more affirmative answers in general. Now, returning to the tricks and twists, the current situation does actually give streamers another competitive advantage over linear broadcasters, and that's because, unlike the later, streamers are not bound to schedules. No one is really specifically counting their production hours or that a show has to deliver a stellar episode every Sunday night, for instance. So there is more space to kind of maneuver and also trick the people's minds a bit. So we can be pretty certain that the shift of viewing towards the streaming will further increase this winter, I think, probably at a faster pace than we could expect normally. But that said, it's not all that gloomy for traditional broadcasters. As long as they realize the power of the BVOD or broadcast video on demand and do not continue to position their own online platforms as some kind of suffix or blind gut to their scheduled channels, as we can see that with UK's ITV, for instance, that there was a full ahead given recently by the management to AVOD originals specifically and also for international co-productions, something that in some regions like the Nordics, for example, is a norm already for a few years.
So do we think we're going to see a change in viewers' tastes this winter?
I don't think that much is going to change genre-wise this winter. Audiences will still be trying to escape this daunting reality. But again, I want to stress that we are all very different, and what's escapism for someone is just boring for someone else. So yes, the family-friendly, light-hearted, fun shows will prevail, but there will always be audience also for horror, monsters, and sci-fi, because believe it or not, there are people who may see it as escapism for themselves, if not for any other reason than just for assuring that actually things are not as bad after all. It's enough to look at the screen and you see that things could actually get so much worse. And thanks God, these monsters and zombies are not coming at us in the real world. And also, post 2020, we are going to start seeing more diversity on and also off screen, of course. We have been talking about it for years, but this year and Black Lives Matter have given it a real push. And in broader sense, not just about talking about ethnicity. And we are also likely to see more fresh unscripted programming this winter than drama series, since the development and production cycle of factual and also most of entertainment is considerably shorter than for scripts. And adding to that, the financial strains experienced by many broadcasters this year due to decline in advertising, I would expect that's one direction in which many commissioners and also distributors must have been focusing on more than before, when everybody seemed carried away with, not losing out on the momentum while the golden age of scripted lasts. And finally, advertising dollars will start. And I think they are already starting to flow back into the industry. While the households will still have to make tough cost-cutting decisions, brands will need to start spending again, as every crisis is also an opportunity. Like I like to stress again and again, many businesses will try to use this time, particularly now while the viewing numbers are going to stay higher than in normal circumstances. And to reach their audiences, brands will try to increase their market, and for that they need to be seen and heard. And even those that might be still bleeding financially eventually will have to make a decision to invest in their brand marketing as a priority, since otherwise they would just risk to lose out to competition. As historically, there are many examples showing that some of the biggest brands we know today have emerged actually during a crisis. And I'm stressing this now because I think that creators and distributors alike should get prepared to take this money when such momentum arrives. As one thing that's very different is now that this time the brands will be looking to invest in much, much smarter, calculated ways than before, looking for projects and platforms that can actually deliver on reaching specific audience groups and bringing measurable returns.
Yeah, much smarter advertising is really going to come through. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I wonder whether you're talking about there's going to be higher audiences, both for streamers, but presumably this winter for, getting back to maybe those spring levels of audiences, but also we'll have advertisers as well. So, it may become a bit of a boom time for broadcasters.
Yes, let's keep fingers crossed. It could really help to recover many of them.
That would be very interesting. Maybe we can have a look at that after Christmas and get an idea of how those numbers are stacking up. But Gertz, wrap up warm and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for joining us again, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Well, that's about it for this week's show. Thanks as always for listening. Please remember to rate and subscribe to the show and share it with friends and colleagues. And we've just set up a new networking group for listeners to TellyCast called TellyCast Community. It's a place to discuss the TV industry issues raised in the show. And we'd also love to hear your suggestions for future show topics and guests. Just search TellyCast Community in the group section on LinkedIn, and we'll see you there. This week's TellyCast was sponsored by Moore Kingston Smith. And if you want to hear more about our advertising and sponsorship packages, please email justin@boomdialogue.com. That's justin@boomdialogue.com. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers. Until next week, as always, stay safe.